Hello, this is Gabriel Zamora, Features Editor at 2dx.com, and I want to thank you for checking out my Dark Souls 2 Beta Impressions video. A few weeks back, I participated in the first of the North American Dark Souls 2 beta tests, and you can see that gameplay session almost in its entirety by clicking the link in the description or the annotation I'm adding to the video. From Software makes some pretty significant changes to the Demons and Dark Souls gameplay mechanics in the upcoming Dark Souls 2. While it adheres to most of the gameplay rules that those past games established, it reworks a lot of them and adds new mechanics to the mix, which makes the overall gameplay experience more robust and polished. If you've been following Namco Bandai or From Software or Dark Souls 2 news in general, you may know a lot of this information already, but I thought I'd put all the content and mechanics that I came across during the beta into one neat video package, so please enjoy. Since Dark Souls 2 is an RPG, leveling up is an important factor in respect to making your character stronger. When you compare it to past games, a lot of the stats that you boost and level up in Dark Souls 2 have been given additional functions, and the game even introduces new stats into the mix. I'll go over some of these right now. Vigor determines how much health your character has, which replaces Vitality from the first Dark Souls game. Endurance from the first Dark Souls game has been broken up into two stats in Dark Souls 2. Endurance in Dark Souls 2 determines how much stamina your character has, whereas Vitality determines your equipment load. In other words, Vitality is what determines how much crap your character can carry around. Attunement determines how many spells you can equip at any one time. Boosting attunement also increases your spellcasting speed in Dark Souls 2, which was governed by dexterity in the first Dark Souls game. Strength boosts a weapon's attack power, pretty obviously, and it allows you to wield heavier weapons as you could in past games. Dexterity, on the other hand, allows players to use agile weapons like rapiers and daggers. In Dark Souls 2, dexterity also boosts the effect of poisonous or bleed-inducing attacks. Resistance determines your defense and a player's resistance to poison and bleeding. In the previous game, resistance was largely useless, because all stats boosted your resistances, so there was no reason to bother leveling this particular stat up. Unfortunately, I didn't get around to playing with this stat as much as I would have liked during the beta, but I'd like to think that it's a little more relevant this time around. Agility is an all-new stat, and it boosts your character's movement speed, evasion speed, and important actions like that. Again, I didn't get enough time to play around with this stat to notice enough benefits from it. The many spell branches in the Souls series have been merged under two key attributes in Dark Souls 2. Intelligence allows players to use higher level magics, specifically boosting magic and fire-based spells and attacks, whereas Faith allows players to use miracle, dark, and lightning-based spells, and boost the effect of those spells when leveled. All of these stats have numerical representation on the level up screen, so you can easily see important performance stats like spellcasting speed, your attack powers, and your defenses. My only real gripe with the level up system in the beta thus far is that attributes and stats are all represented by icons rather than actual words. So in my case, I had to constantly press select to highlight the stats description, just to make sure it was the one that I wanted to level up. Another important change to the system is that special armor has stat requirements now, in the same way that weapons do. In the beta, heavier armors had a strength requirement that needed to be met before you can effectively use them. But icons for dexterity, intelligence, and faith also appear, which suggests to me that there will be armors in the game that have stat requirements for those attributes as well. Armor even benefits from attribute bonuses, aka scaling. This means that the armor is more effective when its requirement stats are boosted. The Faram armor, for example, has a strength requirement of 13 and has a D attribute bonus tied to strength. Assuming that scaling works in the same way that it did in Dark Souls, this means that boosting a character's strength stat will subtly boost or scale the effectiveness of the Faram armor when worn. Now that stats and attributes are out of the way, let's take a look at the actual gameplay changes. The first major change to the gameplay is the dual-wielding mechanic. In past games, you could equip a weapon in each hand, but you couldn't effectively fight with both. The number of moves you could perform with a weapon in your left hand was extremely limited. Dark Souls 2 allows you to actually combo with both weapons by introducing a dual-wielding stance. By pressing and holding the triangle button briefly, you'll enter this stance. Pressing L1 or L2 while in this stance will allow you to attack with both weapons at once. Dual-wielding attacks get a very nice attack bonus as well, which makes for great incentive to use this mechanic. The flip side is that you cannot block or parry while you're in this stance, so you need to be particularly good at evading or moving around to avoid taking damage. But dual-wielding extends beyond melee weapons. Entering dual-wielding stance with a shield in your left hand allows you to two-hand your shield. This lets you block and parry as normal, but also allows you to use your shield offensively for shield bashes and heavy blows. Dual-wielding with a crossbow will allow you to two-hand it. This, in turn, allows you to manually aim the crossbow, which you couldn't actually do in past games. The next major change is how spellcasting has been reworked. All spells have a limited number of uses that a player can exhaust. It works exactly the same way that it did in Dark Souls. However, players can cast light or heavy versions of the same spell this time around by pressing the light or heavy attack buttons. The heavy version of a spell costs the same as a light version, but requires more stamina and has a longer casting time. What enriches this all even further is that two-handing a spellcasting weapon allows players to cast two alternate versions of the spell as well. I liken it to the base spells in Dark Souls. You have Soul Arrow, then Heavy Soul Arrow, then Great Soul Arrow, then Great Heavy Soul Arrow. In Dark Souls 2, you can essentially cast four versions of the same spell just by changing your stance. This adds a significant layer of depth to spellcasting, as players who want to play as mage-type characters now have much more versatility with their spells at any one time. I didn't try out all spell and stance combinations, unfortunately, but if this four-version spellcasting mechanic extends to all spells in the full game, Dark Souls 2 will be huge fun for mage classes. New magic restorative items have been introduced in Dark Souls 2 as well, which harkens back to the spice items from Demon Souls. Unlike in Demon Souls, however, these items only restore a set number of castings to whatever spell you currently have equipped. Nonetheless, it's good that mage classes can restore some of their magical abilities without having to rest at a bonfire and reviving every enemy in the area. And the icing on the cake, I think, is that mage characters can now manually aim their spells with a reticle in the same way that bows and now crossbows can, by two-handing a spellcasting weapon. So now let's look at some general gameplay. As an adventurer in a dark fantasy, you fight with swords and sorcery and all sorts of medieval weaponry against monsters and demons and undead within a dying and hostile realm. The beta touches a few interesting bits of background lore, like the fact that you're in a realm called Drangleek, and it's been in ruins since a war tore the region apart long ago. But apart from that, the game leaves you to your own devices. Almost immediately after starting, you'll notice how dark the game is, and I mean quite literally dark. You enter a cave and can see absolutely nothing beyond a few feet, much like Tomb of the Giants in the first Dark Souls game. Dark Souls 2 makes heavy use of lighting and traveling with torchlight. I honestly thought the mechanic was a gimmick when I first encountered it during E3, but the beta makes great use of it and really drives home how atmospheric and frightening the game world is without light. You'll be traveling between light and darkened areas constantly, encouraging you to carry a torch with you at all times. The problem with this is that you can't really use any other weapon or equipment assigned to your torch hand while the torch is burning because it will go out. In a pinch, you can use the torch as a melee weapon, but for the most part, you have to choose between fighting with weakened defense and offenses, but with good lighting, or fighting with your full defensive and offensive capabilities but in inky darkness. It's a harrowing experience either way, and the Dark Souls 2 beta throws this scenario at you quite often. Fortunately, the game doesn't abuse the mechanic either. In between bonfire checkpoints, players will often come across unlit stone torches. You can give life to these torches, which not only illuminates the area very well, but stay lit should the player die. So players can revisit these torches and relight their own if they need to. This takes a lot of stress out of exploring, since you don't have to backtrack all the way to a bonfire if you accidentally put out your own torch. That, and it's nice to know that there's a room with a reliable light source that you can turn to when you need it. What set this particular beta test apart from previous ones was the difficulty hike during the last half hour of the session. I had switched to the sorceress at this point, so I can't accurately gauge how much more powerful the enemies were, since she has low resistances and defense to begin with. With that said, the giant sickle-wielding undead could drop her life to nearly nothing in a single swing. I also noticed that enemies got new attacks as well. So said sickle-wielding undead had a grab attack they would use following a howl. Previously, only the Red Phantom version of these enemies would do that attack. The undead rogues you fight throughout the beta also got a new jump attack combo, which they didn't have earlier. And as I mentioned before, all enemies did noticeably more damage. I don't quite know what the difficulty spike means for the final game. According to the message that we received, it said something about like a difficulty select, and I hope that's not what it means, but I don't know. I speculate that it was a brief test of the Dark Souls 2 New Game Plus mechanic. In Dark Souls, players could restart the game after beating the final boss in New Game Plus mode, which increased the enemy's health and their aggression. So I suspect that the difficulty increase and the enemy changes were meant to represent what New Game Plus would be like. I don't know though, the message did throw me off, as you can see in the video. But now for the combat, what I'm sure everybody wants to know about. There are changes to the combat system that greatly affect PvP and PvE, so I thought it best to talk about those changes alongside some combat footage. Backstabs have been reworked to function as a strike rather than a scripted auto attack. Essentially, if your character is in backstab range, he or she will initiate a pommel strike against the enemy's back. If that connects, the backstab animation will follow. If it misses, or if the enemy moves out of the way, the backstab will simply fail. This works very well in PvE, where latency and server issues don't affect computer-controlled enemies. In PvP, I've had some weird results, and I feel that latency might be to blame. I've encountered lag stabs where my character snaps behind an opponent to perform a backstab despite being seemingly nowhere near them. And I've encountered simultaneous backstabs where me and my opponent backstab one another at the same time. For what it's worth though, I can say that I experienced much less backstabbing per battle in Dark Souls 2 than I did in the original Dark Souls. Since this was a stress test, I'm not particularly worried about the roughness of the backstab mechanic yet. I'm sure the kinks will be worked out in time for the game's launch next year. Ripostes have been redesigned so that players can't abuse the invincibility as effectively. After successfully parrying an enemy's attack, the target enters a lengthy animation whereby it collapses on the floor. Only when the enemy is helpless on the floor can you actually riposte them. This means that you're vulnerable for a few seconds in between a parry and a riposte, leaving you open to other enemies or summoned allies. Dark Souls 2 introduces new guard breaking and riposte mechanic as well. In Dark Souls, players who used up all their stamina to guard against attacks would enter a guard break state, leaving them defenseless for a few seconds. Enemies weren't really designed to take advantage of this, and its use was, I honestly think, somewhat limited in PvP. In Dark Souls 2, however, a unique and powerful riposte is available for players who successfully break their opponent's guard. And more importantly, it's actually possible to break an opponent's guard without depleting their stamina first. Dark Souls had a kick attack that did heavy stamina damage to blocking enemies. It was the most effective way to wear down your target's stamina or to set up a combo. In Dark Souls 2, the kick is replaced with a heavy pommel strike. In my experience, this attack will break an opponent's guard outright, leaving them open to the new riposte attack. As you can see in the clip here, my opponent hits me with the attack and breaks my guard despite me having full stamina. It's an amazing way to counter players who like to hide behind their shields, and I used it to great effect during the beta. Dark Souls 2 also seems to have a dedicated combo system in effect, which is somewhat new to the series, I think. Enemies can be stun locked with basic attacks very easily, and won't escape unless you run out of stamina, they get pushed out of range, or if they're naturally resistant to stunning, like the big sickle-wielding undead. Now I know that you could technically combo basic enemies in the first Dark Souls game, however, this didn't really extend to PvP. Your opponent could break out of a combo after the second hit or so, and there were techniques that players could exploit to break out of a combo earlier. This is not the case in Dark Souls 2. In Dark Souls 2, you're pretty much stun locked until the player drops the combo. Poise does have a direct effect to how easily you can fall prey to a combo. I found that, much like in Dark Souls, players with heavier armor could take a hit without being interrupted, so you wouldn't want to trade blows with them if you had light armor, as I did. I'm neutral towards this new combo system. I don't think it's bad or good, just different. I learned through PvP pretty quickly that it's in your best interest to keep a combo going once you land that first hit. Combos are a great way to chew through your enemy's health, so if you get the opportunity to use one, there's no reason not to. Another change to the combat system is that you can now heal yourself during PvP and invasions. The original Dark Souls game restricted how you can heal yourself, so you were limited to only humanity items. The easier healing does take some of the edge off of the combo system, so you can heal up should you make a mistake and get caught in a combo. In my experience, it didn't really drag fights out as much as you would think. Yes, there were times where you were close to defeating an enemy and they got away and snuck a heal in, but for the most part, combat moved fast enough that this was never really a problem. I found that most of my fights only lasted maybe a minute at most, either way, win or lose. All in all, I had great fun playing with Dark Souls 2 during the beta. I'm going to leave you guys with some PvP footage of my wins and losses. I want to thank you all again for watching, and hopefully we'll meet when the game launches next year. See you then.